Thank you for joining us this morning, this afternoon, depending upon where you're calling in or dialing in from. It's going to be a relatively short webinar on the subject of integrated spill response strategies and the unseen consequences. I'm presenting this as an oil spill responder. I work for OSRL. I've been at OSRL for circa 2 years. I've recently joined the inland core group, of which I'll talk about a little later in the presentation. Just before we get set with the slides, can I just double check everyone can see the shared screen, i.e. the opening slide? I should take the silence as a yes. So let's get cracking. So in way of an introduction, OSRL proactively seeks opportunities to collaborate with industry. This applies across the business, and perhaps more so in the subject matter expert program. The subject matter expert program, otherwise referred to as the SME program, exists primarily to enhance its members' capability and consequently enhance the organisation-wide discipline capability in the group's respective technical areas. As I alluded to a little earlier, I'm presently sat in the inland core group, which is one of 8 groups. Others include dispersant, IMS, situational awareness, cold weather, so on and so forth. So within the inland group, there are 5 of us. Most of us have a degree of experience, prior experience in inland. By no means are we the definitive source or repository of all information inland. That's the purpose of our being. It's to try and pull that information together to serve the wider business. The programme has recently seen a change in personnel. This is a result of a redesign. So it has existed for several years. The decision was taken just to reformat that slightly to change the trajectory. Having previously focused on surface water response, the decision has been taken that the inland SME will now redress this imbalance and concentrate its efforts on onshore receptors, which includes groundwater, of course. The basis for this particular presentation is a paper that was recently co-authored by OSRL and Regenesis for the Arctic Marine Oil Spill Programme, otherwise known as AMOP. Regenesis are an independent entity. They offer remediation technologies and services for the treatment of a wide range of contaminants. This includes petroleum hydrocarbons. They treat contamination via enhanced bioremediation, chemical oxidation, desorption, absorption, so on and so forth. The title of the paper is a hint at what we're trying to do with regards to this collaboration. It's integrating other services with what we do at present, or what the wider OSRO community does at present. So that would be, in the context of Regenesis, that would be subsurface response. And the question we ask is, does this require a paradigm shift, significant change in the way in which we work? And in short, probably not. Simple modifications of conventional response methods are likely to increase the opportunities for integration. That is to say, we can more or less continue as we are with a greater awareness of what that data might mean to our partners in industry. It goes without saying that there'll be unintended consequences of what we do during conventional response for those that may enter the scene later in the response. So again, in this context, that would be those involved in remediation and contaminated land remediation, most to the point. Some of those consequences will be positive, others will be potentially negative and detract from the work they're trying to do. However, betterment remains the overarching objective. So this reaching out, this collaboration, the end goal is to improve the service we offer to our members. Opportunities for integration. The obvious place to start was to explore the capabilities which are described in the tiered preparedness and response concept, or by the concept rather. This concept, many of you will be familiar with it. It was born circa in the early 80s. It's taken on many iterations. It's now evolved into a wheel, which is what you see on the present slide, consisting of 15 capabilities, some more or less relevant to this particular theme. The distribution of those capabilities is split between 3 tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3, which describes local, regional, and global facilities, respectively. The wheel was introduced in guidance published by the IOGP, IPICA, Oil Spill Response Joint Industry Project, otherwise known as the JIP project, which was established in 2011 to implement learning opportunities in respect of oil spill preparedness. response following the well control incident in the Gulf of Mexico, the anniversary of which was yesterday. As an example, again, just to try and put this in, or frame this in the context of today's presentation, broadly speaking, there's a correlation. We see a correlation, anecdotally, if by no other means, between remoteness of a location and population's direct reliance upon natural resources, including raw water, i.e. groundwater in many instances. Therefore, the remediation of an oil spill in a remote location might be subject to more stringent remedial targets than an equivalent spill where there's more established infrastructure. Water treatment works would be an example. However, there's often an inverse relationship between remoteness and the access to resources to undertake remediation work, and this presents a dilemma. The shortfall can be mitigated in a number of ways, most obvious of which being either to develop Tier 1 and 2 resources, or facilitating access to Tier 3 resources, aka the likes of OSRL and other OSROs globally. A starting point would be to establish that risk profile. That's where this TPR will come to the fore. TPR will come to the fore. During preparedness work, this is notoriously complicated. Science alone can't answer the questions of whether or not a given possibility of significant harm is significant, since what is either significant or unacceptable is a matter of socio-political judgment. And this is subject to fluxes on an ongoing basis. This changes on a country by country, government by government, or tenures of governments. So there's that lack of continuity. So it's important that OSROs and our partners understand what we're trying to do and have a common, or we're all on the same page, as it were. Because of these, the differences in viewpoints, the law entrusts decisions on these matters to enforcing authorities, so the regulators in each of the operating countries. So again, there might be some discrepancies there globally, so we need to understand those differences. When we're reaching out and looking for collaboration, it's important that those partners have the wherewithal to work in those theatres. The integration of subsoil and groundwater remediation would potentially span several of the existing capabilities, 4 of which are highlighted in yellow. Environmental impact and assessment, which includes sampling. So you might want to increase the scope to sample, so look at sampling regimes to afford those coming after us with a better understanding of what's happening on site. The other is waste management. It goes without saying to treat waste in situ, i.e. subsurface treatment or response constitutes waste treatment in situ. So as opposed to, crudely speaking, a dig and dump and then dealing with that waste ex situ, it remains on site. It's less intrusive, less costly, and certainly a lesser risk of secondary contamination. Inland response, that's the obvious, that would be the go-to. And shoreline inland assessment. We're going to come on to SCAT shortly for those of you that aren't overly familiar with it as a concept. It refers to shoreline specifically, but that doesn't mean to say it can't be transposed across other environments, and indeed it has been. So 3 subjects we're going to touch upon lightly: awareness, SEMA, spill impact mitigation assessment, and potential for integration. So awareness, this is reference to the necessity to understand how oil is likely to behave subsurface. It's very difficult to make informed decisions if we're entering or starting out blind. So generally speaking, LNAPL, so the light non-aqueous phase liquids would migrate, rather the migration immediately following a release would typically entail vertical transport under the influence of gravity. This would be accompanied by lateral spreading due to geologic properties, either what the subsurface comprises of. If the release is small, the percolation will be limited to the unsaturated zone, that is the dry subsoil or subsurface, or the dose zone in more technical terms. And as the mass is immobilized, whilst it migrates through this unsaturated zone by retentive capillarity forces, it will prevent it from reaching groundwater potentially. So it might afford you more time to implement response measures. For larger releases, the LNAPL, this light non-aqueous phase liquid, will continue to migrate downward and pose a greater threat to the underlying water table. Once it's contacted the saturated zone, that is the water table, the groundwater, in common terminology, the vertical migration of the LNAPL will continue until buoyancy, and increasing water content impede its vertical migration, so it's downward movement. And the resulting L-NAPL body will then continue to migrate laterally following the water table down hydraulic gradient and radially due to the L-NAPL mounding. This is portrayed by the image on the slide at present. So the top of the two shows the spill in the first instance. It's reached the water table. You've got that vertical penetration until it finds it stabilizes with buoyancy, and the absence of any interstitial space gets all occupied by water. And again, this is light, light N, so this is light non-aqueous phase liquid, aka it sits on the surface as opposed to sinking, which would be a DNAPL, a dense non-aqueous phase liquid. Once it's accumulated on the surface, it then behave as described. So you can see that in the second image where it starts spreading laterally across the surface, and you create that head. So as you do on the surface, you have your contours. We talk about groundwater contours, and they wouldn't necessarily correspond with the surface. So as a rule of thumb, they tend to fall from high to low areas, but there are exceptions, so we must be mindful of that when we're making decisions. So it's relatively straighthtforward to understand what's going to happen in the first instance, certainly in the context of L-NAPL. So once we've established the way which is likely to behave subsurface, that will then inform our decision making as to how we're going to go about responding. We want to then incorporate that understanding in the SEMA process. So SEMA, spill impact mitigation assessment, would incorporate or want to account for subsurface factors. So when we're making those decisions, they want to be consultative and they want to be objective. So we want to be incorporating all factors within the environment, i.e. the receptors and pathways, one of which would be, or rather a host of which would be subsurface. So what we do above ground will affect what's going on subsurface, so we need to ensure that that's been incorporated in that decision making during the SEMA or rather the SEMA process. When we're developing the tactics through SEMA, it's important to appreciate that tactics will vary wildly as response objectives range between no treatment to a zero tolerance position. That zero tolerance tends to be more prevalent in an inland environment, just because of the absence of dilution and the greater proximity to population, so to people and the likelihood of affecting their livelihoods. No treatment is perhaps a little cynical. That might refer to something such as monitor and evaluate, which is obviously a proactive measure, but takes some justification. It's often met with a level of criticism by onlookers. And then integration. So I alluded to SCAT in the previous slide. This is shoreline cleanup assessment techniques, albeit it refers directly to shoreline. In the first instance, it was developed for that purpose shortly after, or rather during the Exxon Valdez response. It has been ported across to other domains. In this instance here, you see an image on the left-hand side of the slide. This is a heat map of the output from a SCAT survey inland. In a nutshell, the heat map is demonstrative of where the oil is present and where it is absent. It's fairly straightforward as to how that would be workable in an inland situation. There are some parameters that need tweaking. There are operators that have created apps to simplify this process in field. And again, some of the questions asked need to be reworked so they're more applicable to the environment to avoid any confusion and make sure there's that consistency throughout industry. It doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see how this might be improved upon for the purposes of this exercise. We're already talking about subsurface oiling. The excerpt at the bottom of that slide in pink is lifted directly from the OSRL field guide on SCAT, which states the presence of subsurface oil can be revealed by digging trial pits or trenches in shoreline, such as investigation should be undertaken if there is an expectation or a suspicion that oil is buried. Again, that's where the awareness is key. To suspect oil is present would imply that there is an understanding of how these processes work. So we're digging in the right places. We might then take that a little further and then adopt a systematic approach. If we want to delineate that distribution, so the heat map, it plots the surface distribution of oil. It stands to reason that in places we would anticipate having some subsurface impact. So if we're going to explore that and delineate both in three dimensions, so laterally and vertical distribution, we might want to impose a systematic sampling regime. So the image top right, you can see how that would simply fit, transpose across to that heat map. You might want to simply impose sampling locations across your heat map. The quadrants in the heat map, just as an aside, were pre-existing. They predated the survey. They're fire breaks. Which formed fairly fortuitous lines upon which to work. made mapping that much easier and makes it look a little more interesting. But the point being is that you might well allocate sampling or samples to each of those quadrants. So relatively straightforward in the grand scheme of things. So we've spoken about improved awareness, systematic sampling. The two in tandem will increase the breadth of data arising from that initial response. It goes without saying there'll be a little additional burden here, so it's going to be a little more time consuming. There's expectation you've got people in field who understand what it is they're looking for. So the suspicion referred to in the field guide is based upon some deliberation. Once we have this information, it can then be processed and passed to those that may follow after the OSRO's response, which in brief would be to deal with the gross contamination and then hand over to the regulatory authority or potentially those working in remediation and nuanced work subsurface. So the sort of information we'd be looking at would be characterising geology, groundwater, reporting on any historic contamination we might have encountered. This is all information that can be of great use when the third party is looking at formulating a subsurface response. The additional data sets will aid the plume delineation, so we have a better understanding of where it is, so we can account for that oil when we're looking at mass balance. It may contribute to a DQRA process, so the detailed quantitative risk assessment. So if we're being pushed by a regulator or the responsible party is being pushed by the regulator to define remedial targets, generally speaking, we would revert to a DQRA of some description. It's often a lot easier to defend quantitative targets. They tend to be less subjective. Not always, but in most instances tend to be less subjective and more objective and more robust when subject to scrutiny. So some of the response options that might supplement a conventional OSRO response, these are a number of responses or detailed number of responses that are on offer by or from Regenesis. In summary, a common approach to contaminated land remediation would be to combine action for source reduction with action for pathway management. For example, encouraging in situ remediation processes, typically in groundwater. You can break that down to two parts. The source reduction typically is what we'd be busy with. We're looking at that gross contamination, the fresh oil we see on the surface, the big conglomerations of oil, we'd busy ourselves with that. Meanwhile, subsurface, there may be further work to be conducted. Again, this would be subject to SEMA. It may well be that there's a net negative, further negative impact to go after that contamination. So the decision may be taken simply to monitor and evaluate. This will vary on a case-by-case basis. However, should there be a requirement to persevere on site and look to treat subsurface contamination, we'd want to be able to signpost members to those with the necessary technical wherewithal to conduct that work. It's not a domain that OSRO are looking at exploring with the mind of adopting the work. It is genuinely a case of adopting relationships with people in industry who have established a foothold and a reputation, so we can then signpost members rather than walk away, but distance ourselves after having contended with the gross contamination. We maintain that continuity, and these are people that we can vouch for in simple terms. So some of the technologies on offer from Regenesis would include in situ desorption and augmented recovery. This is designed to enhance the recoverable mass subsurface. In general terms, the hope here would be to shorten the pump and treat duration. So pump and treats are a go-to subsurface treatment mechanisms, particularly where you have impacted groundwater. The image bottom right of this slide would show the concentration versus time of a pump and treat system. So that black line you can see there that drops off quite dramatically in the first instance and then slows, it becomes asymptotic. That is to say, the two lines converge, but they never intersect. So that cleanup standard that's been imposed, whether that be derived from a DQRA or imposed arbitrarily by a regulator or other party, we're trying to reach that point. When it becomes asymptotic, you can go on pumping in perpetuity. You'll never reach that point. There are obvious implications here, more so than cost and perhaps the potential to invest resource elsewhere to provide greater betterment. So we can enhance that recovery and bring those two lines together far sooner if we supplement with desorption and augment the recovery. it will eliminate, or rather reduce the likelihood of rebound post pump and treat. Quite often what you see is after a pump and treat system is switched off, you'll have a resurgence in concentrations in groundwater because you create an imbalance between what is absorbed to the subsoil media, or the substrate, and the groundwater. So that imbalance, we see a rush of contaminant from the substrate to the groundwater post pump and treat. So you'll achieve a reasonable level, switch off the system, and then you'll have that phenomenal rebound. It is almost inevitable unless you treat the absorbed contaminants. Increased removal of higher molecular weight, lower solubility hydrocarbons. Again, pump and treat, you're focusing your attention upon the dissolved components as opposed to the free phase, and those that are absorbed to subsoil media. If we can mobilize the subsoil media into solution, that affords us a great opportunity to recover via pump and treat, more conventional methods. It would also offer opportunity to treat a smear zone. So if you imagine there's fluxes in groundwater, almost inevitable, you'll see seasonal changes, and locally you may see changes associated with abstraction, cones of depression. So that will result in oil being deposited in the interface zone between vadose, so that is the unsaturated and the saturated, as that water moves. And when you pump and treat, you may miss that soil. So if we can flush that, if we can treat that and desorb to these groundwater, again, it increases the likelihood of our recovering that oil. The second technology, so I mentioned here, is in situ chemical oxidation. This works on a number of processes such as cleaving and hydrolysis. This leads to the production of intermediates and eventually, in simple terms, carbon dioxide and water. In this case, they're using a percarbonate oxidant. This is chemical oxidation. This isn't bio-augmentation, albeit there may be subsequent bio-augmentation as a result of this. It's probably worth saying that there's no observed impact upon the microfauna subsequent to such applications. The third is enhanced aerobic bioremediation. This is less intrusive. However, it's dependent upon a number of other factors. So we spoke about solubility of the hydrocarbon. This solubility is a direct function, or rather will directly affect the bioavailability of the hydrocarbon to microorganisms subsurface. The distribution of free phase and dissolved phase, we have to be cautious if we're mobilizing free phase. It may then introduce or increase the toxicity to subsoil flora and fauna. It tends to be a short-lived impact. They're highly fecund. They bounce back very quickly. The temperature of groundwater, this varies greatly across the globe, so we need to understand what sort of temperatures we're working with. You can supplement that. You can heat groundwater to increase the rate of metabolism and the rate of reaction. This is a possibility, but obviously, again, there are cost implications, and it depends upon the size of the area we're working in. And the availability of electron acceptors. This is what we're supplementing as part of the enhanced aerobic bioremediations. We're talking about the redox, the reduction oxidation processes. We can supplement that and enhance the rate at which that occurs. The fourth and final that we're going to touch upon here is colloidal activated carbon absorption and remediation. So we're using an activated carbon, so it's a milled carbon, so it has a huge surface area. It's often used in filters above ground, commonly used in the UK for domestic spills, forecourts. This is an advance upon that. It will be a subsurface injection of the colloidal activated carbon, so it's colloidal form, so it's in solution, which allows you to pump it freely. It treats dissolved phase hydrocarbons, that is to say they're absorbed to the carbon, which means that they're static. So your sessile species, those species that aren't mobile, are able to readily access and metabolize the contaminants. So this would constitute an active barrier. That is to say, it's a barrier which is permeable to groundwater, so you're not creating any ponding or obstruction or long-term damage. The water will pass through, and then you'd hope to see this assimilation of hydrocarbons in the CAC, the colloidal activated carbon. So appreciate that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but that's four of the technologies that Regenesis have spoken to us about that may well be of use. And again, it's not for us to push these upon anybody. It's just having this awareness, so we know that should the question be asked of our members, that there are options available, and we can then signpost them to the respective operator, and they can then have that conversation directly. And certainly they've been fairly proactive in the first instance with regard to engaging with OSRL. And if there's anyone on the call who wishes to engage, we'd encourage you to do so. We're happy to sit down and talk. We're keen to learn more. the final slide, just an excerpt from the paper. We closed the paper with a matrix where we've tabulated 13 sort of conventional response tactics. 3 examples given here: interception trenches, introduction of a water bottom, and high volume, low pressure flushing. They're fairly rudimentary, but they're widely practiced and well established. They work in many instances. However, there's always opportunity to improve upon a response. So we put this out to Regenesis and had them comment upon it. A lot of it's fairly self-explanatory. Let's take the first, for example, interception trenches. You'd want to understand the geology. If you're cutting an interception trench and you're introducing direct continuity to groundwater, this is obviously problematic in many instances. So you might want to dig a shallower trench, you might want to lime and bentonite, you might want to weld plastic. There are options, there are ways of working around it as long as we understand what needs doing. So that would be described as mitigation. And in the final column, we're looking at other supplementary remediation techniques. So how can we supplement that existing technology? The suggestion here was that we might introduce the CAC, the colloidal activated carbon, to mitigate against migration of dissolved phase plume. So if we're concerned about that moving elsewhere, so driving, introducing head pressure with that volume of water, we might then look at intercepting that elsewhere to prevent any lateral migration. And like I say, that's just 3 examples of the 13 we've tabulated. That remains in a prototype form. The paper has been submitted for publication or rather presentation at AMOP, but it will be revisited shortly. The intention of the paper is to understand the importance of ground conditions when choosing response tactics and how these tactics might be improved upon, and this would all be worked up through CEMA. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you ever so much for your time. Are there any questions?